Hey, welcome back. This is part four of my four-part series on the periodization of nutrition when training for an extreme endurance or in my case, ultra marathon running events. Like I've mentioned in the intro and in the last three phases, is I follow a high-fat approach. But I also look at my lifestyle when I'm kind of developing how I'm going to put that nutrition piece together. And the way I kind of see it is that I'm a different person depending on what phase of training I'm in. When I'm resting and recovering, I'm a much different active. I'm much different active wise than I am when I'm in like peak training mode. So I try to kind of match my nutrition approach to the activity or lifestyle that I'm currently in. If you haven't listened to the first three, I definitely would encourage you to do that first, as it'll really lay out kind of how I get to this fourth and final phase, which is kind of the taper and the race itself. It does a thorough job of kind of breaking down exactly what I'm doing macronutrient wise, why I'm doing it, and kind of what my thoughts or approach is with that. So if you've listened to those and you're ready to kind of learn about that last phase, here we go. So the taper and the race phase are really interesting to me. I feel like of all the phases, this one is a little more varied in terms of what I'm doing. Partly because the race itself is a fairly unnatural experience. Running, all day long tends to be a stress on your body that's not necessarily what I would consider normal or ideal, really, from a health standpoint. But I do enjoy it, so it's something I strive to do regardless. The taper is interesting in the sense that it kind of starts to mimic a little more of some of those early stages of training where my volume is a little lower. Where it ranges differently there is during my taper, I try not to necessarily go into complete recovery rest mode because I still want to stay sharp for the race itself. So what I'm typically doing during a taper is I'm still doing some kind of key sharpening workouts, but I'm looking at them in a little different lens. I'm looking at them in a way where I want to kind of try to maintain the fitness I've developed without stressing my body to the extent where I can't easily recover. Because I want to show up to the race feeling rest and recovered, but I also want to be feeling fit and sharp. So usually what that means is the intensity workouts or the workouts tend to be a little shorter, and I tend to give myself a little more time to recover in between them. So maybe instead of doing like a tempo run, then an easy day, and then an interval workout, I would maybe do a tempo run with 2 or 3 days in between that interval workout. So the way that kind of comes across from a nutritional standpoint is I'm balancing it a little bit. I'm still kind of looking to hit some of those carbohydrate sources on the more intensity days, albeit a little lower since I'm not going to probably be coming back as hard the very next day. So I just don't feel like I need to quickly replenish my glycogen stores as fast as I would during the phase 3 where my volume and intensity are both at their highest. But I am also, trying to keep in mind that I want my body to maintain that metabolic flexibility where I feel like I can kind of hit that last gear through glycogen if I need to, but also be very, very fat adapted in a way that I can run at a more moderate or slow pace without feeling like I'm going to bonk or feel like my hunger needs aren't being met. So the way it kind of looks is a lot of times during my taper, if I'm kind of do more of a 3-week taper, I try to structure it as like what I would call a reverse taper, where that 3rd week out from the race is actually more rest in the second, because I'll have just come off one of my biggest training blocks and my body's definitely asking for some rest and recovery. So that 3rd week out, I'm a lot more likely to probably drop my carbohydrates down to some of those more phase 1 levels of down to 5%, as I'm kind of like really resting and recouping from that last training block. And as I kind of get into that second week of the taper, that's when I'll start to drop in some of those more those specific workouts like I mentioned before, that are just a little lower in volume and a little more space between each one. During that week or during that stretch of time, that's where I'm going to do some smaller carb introductions with some of my meals. And then as I get closer to the race, like within that 7 to maybe even 10 days, depending on kind of how my body's feeling and what I feel it needs most, I'll start out that kind of last week or so going really low carbohydrate. What I'm trying to do there is just kind of remind my body again, fat's the primary fuel source, and really kind of prepare my muscle glycogen, or my muscles, to be very receptive to taking in out glycogen as I get closer to the race itself, and do bring back some carbs than those couple days before. So after about probably 5, maybe 7 of the most days of going really low carb, like in phase 1, I'm usually 2-ish days out from the race. That's when I'll start kind of focusing on a little closer to that phase 3 nutrition protocol, where my carbohydrates are sometimes creeping up in that 20 to 30% range. Like I mentioned in some of the other videos, I'm always pretty mindful of how I consume those concentrated carb sources. I try not to consume them in isolation. I want to kind of get them in with some protein and fat, so my body still recognizes that it doesn't want to kind of focus on burning glycogen exclusively, or turning too heavily towards that. Because at the end of the day, what I'm looking for isn't to be in ketosis or to be burning high levels of carbs. My goal is to be fat adapted enough that I can get away with a minimal amount of fueling during the race itself, without necessarily sacrificing some of the high octane benefits from the carbohydrates. So those last 2 days, I'll start bringing back some of that carbohydrate, and then as I wake up the morning of the race, my goal is to start the race with my body feeling like it should burn fat primarily. So I try to have a breakfast that isn't too bulky in terms of like food stuff, because I don't want to get to the starting line with a full stomach either. And I actually skew away from much carbohydrate the morning of too, for that kind of same reason that I want to start the race metabolizing high amounts of fat, and reserve those glycogen stores for parts where I might need to throttle down a little bit, or near the end of the race when you're starting to get a little more tired and a little more fatigue, and you feel like you need that little extra pop. So a lot of times what that'll end up looking like is I'll have my coffee or tea in the morning with some coconut milk, maybe some nut butter like almond butter or something like that. And if I do have any carbohydrates, it'd be just a very little bit of raw honey. And then I get to the starting line feeling like I'm not hungry, but also not like I have a full stomach. And I also am pretty confident that I'm going to start that race burning pretty high levels of fat, since that's pretty much what I just gave my body as its last fuel source. And as the race kind of carries on, I'll get usually somewhere between 30 and 60 minutes in, and that's when I'll start to kind of introduce some of the fuel sources I'm going to be taking in during the day. And this is where it gets a little interesting, because I think a lot of people think, well, if he's focusing on primarily on fat as a fuel source, the most logical thought would be like, well, eat some fat during the race itself. And I take a little different spin on that, and I kind of return to that thought that even the leanest athletes out there, someone who's like 5% body fat, has enough body fat on them to get them through an endurance event. So that's the fuel source that I don't have to worry about depleting during the race. So during the race itself, I'm actually going to try to eat little to no fat, and encourage my body to metabolize body fat during this, because that's something I can easily replace afterwards when I'm recovering. And by doing that, I'm also bypassing the digestive tract, which I think is important, especially when you get to those longer races like 100 milers, where you see a lot of digestive issues rise up in athletes near the end of the race after they've been kind of bombarding their body with food and different stuff all day long, and it kind of eventually starts to rebel on them. So I try to minimize that digestive stimulus by relying on body fat for fat fuel. What I do focus on, though, is the energy source that is finite, which is your glycogen stores. That's what I'm going to try to kind of slowly and gradually introduce during the race itself. The reason I kind of wait until that 30 to 60 minute window is I don't want to necessarily kind of trigger my body to focus on glycogen or sugar, I guess, in the early stages of the race. So I want to get things humming along a bit and get my body metabolizing high ranges of fats before I start slowly dropping in a little bit of carbohydrate along the way. Once I do start doing that, I usually aim for a range of somewhere between maybe 150 to at most 250 calories per hour, and usually the intensity of the race will dictate which end of that kind of spectrum I'll fall into. And what I'm trying to achieve with that is to just kind of slowly trickle in some sugar throughout the course of the day. Not so much that it's going to cause some stomach distress, or not so much that it's going to compromise my ability to kind of burn fat as well during the race. And what I found ends up happening with that is, since that's low enough amount, I don't notice that by the end of a 100-miler that my stomach has started to rebel on me. And to kind of put that into context a little bit, before I started kind of a high-fat approach 6 years ago in 2011, I was very much a high-carbohydrate athlete, and during that stage of my running, I was taking in probably somewhere between 400 to 500 calories per hour. So that was what I would consider a pretty aggressive fueling strategy, and certainly a strategy that can be kind of a coin flip as to whether your stomach holds up to, especially if it gets hot outside, and your body starts diverting blood flow away from your digestion and into things like cooling and muscle function. So being able to kind of essentially cut that in half and feel the same has been a pretty big piece of the puzzle, especially for those longer events when you run a higher risk of having your stomach turn on you. And then after the race, it's kind of starting back up in that phase one where I'm recovering and eventually getting back into some lower intensity, lower volume training. So that's when I kind of revert back to that protocol. As soon as I finish the race, I might take advantage of a little bit of time just to kind of enjoy myself. But within the next day or two, I'm definitely kind of dialing things back into that phase one approach, and sticking to those really low carbohydrate protocol, that more traditional ketogenic style of nutrition, as I let my body recover and let that inflammation and stuff kind of flush out of my body. So that's kind of it with the taper and the race itself. I definitely encourage you to kind of pay attention to all four pieces of this nutrition periodization, and kind of piece it together. And you don't necessarily need to take my experiences and try to mimic it as close to possible. I just encourage you to keep an open mind and try to look at this as something that works for me, and it's something that may be worth exploring for you. But at the end of the day, whatever approach you take, be open-minded and curious enough to step back and analyze whether it's working or not. And if you're honest with yourself, you'll find what works for you, and ultimately, hopefully, have success in whatever athletic endeavor or lifestyle or health endeavor you're going into. Like I mentioned at the end of the last video, if you're more curious of kind of the day-to-day stuff that I'm doing, I would encourage you to head over to my website at zachbitter.com. I've got a blog there where I wrote a detailed explanation of how I do all four of these phases. Or you can kind of follow me on Twitter or Instagram, where I tend to share some of the more everyday things, like specific meals, the hows and the whys of all that stuff. And on Twitter, it's just at ZachBitter. For Twitter, it's at ZBitter, and Instagram is at ZachBitter. Thank you.